Please welcome to the stage, Charles Blow.
Hello, and welcome to Ideas at Forward with Charles Blow, where we bring together some of the world's best thinkers and activists to tackle some of the world's biggest problems. Tonight we're talking about leadership and courage, and it is my pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction in this audience, the boss, Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation. I've seen you interview so many people from this same stage. Now you're in the hot seat, so get ready. So you've written a book, The Idea of America, Reflections on Inequality, Democracy, and the Values We Share. Why did you write this book now?
Well, first, this is really a compendium of things I have written, speeches I've given, and reflections I have had on occasions over my 12 years as president, occasions like the 50th anniversary of the Selma massacre, the moment of realizing that there was a pandemic, the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. So we had moments, and I would often write something, and basically a year ago I was approached by Wiley Publishing, who suggested that maybe some sort of anthology might be useful, and the jury is still out whether it actually will have any impact or anyone will care, but I'm happy we did it.
It's so unrelentingly positive and patriotic. And in an era where people strain to find something to be positive about, they despair a lot. In an era where, people may have more complicated views about their connection to the country, it feels to me almost like an antidote to the times. How do you think of it in this moment?
Well, when you start by observing that it feels patriotic, because it is patriotic, and I think of the people whose shoulders we stand, and I think about the arc of Black people in this country. There is no population of Americans who have been more patriotic,
right,
and who have believed in America than Black people, Black Americans. I absolutely feel called to be patriotic and compelled to believe, because they believed in America. How can you read Frederick Douglass's speech in 1852, what does Independence Day mean to a Black man? I mean, how can you read Langston Hughes's Let America Be America Again, and which he opens
right,
with his rage.
right.
America never was America to me. But he ends with the last stanza in which he says, but oh yes, someday America will be. And so Langston Hughes is saying, in his moment of rage, recognizing that he lives a marginalized life because, in spite of the fact that he is a genius,
Right.
because he is a Black man.
Right.
And yet he ends by saying, oh yes, but one day. And so I think he is speaking to me and to us. And so when on those days when I am dejected and depressed I remember them, and I remember my own privilege. And so that's how I stay positive. That's how I remain hopeful and centered.
But in your book, I would argue that you're making a case that in some ways your patriotism is even deeper than Hughes or Douglass, because what you say is that you always believed that America was rooting for you to succeed, which is not really the Douglass framing, it's not the Hughes framing, but your framing of your success is that what was propelling you was that you believed that America wanted you to be Darren Walker, to succeed. How do you tap into that?
Well, first, I think there is no doubt that I believe that hope and optimism in a moment like this is radical.
Yes.
And so I embrace the radicalism of that idea. And I believe I articulate in that essay that I was the first generation of Blackness in this country that could possibly have had America rooting for it, right? So there is no doubt that before our generation, the manifestation of the kind of tailwinds that I felt, right? And what I mean by that is the cost of education was never a barrier to my getting on the mobility escalator. Mm-hmm. I had scholarships, but even if I hadn't, tuition was so cheap at the University of Texas, and the cost of living and everything that I did, from Head Start to the Pell Grant program, all of that propelled me. And all of that was actually a manifestation for the first time in American history, at the first period of time when this country truly realized the ideal of democracy, at least that everyone has the right to vote, within our lifetime, right? So America, in spite of what we may say to ourselves, was not a democracy until 1964. If you define democracy as a nation where all citizens have access to the core belief of democracy, which is that voting matters and is something that every citizen is entitled to. So we did not have that until our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. And we did not have until our lifetimes the manifestation of what, when I say I felt like America was cheering me on, the larger society and the systems and structures made me feel that I could get on the mobility escalator and ride it as far and high as my talent and my determination and sacrifice would take me.
Let's stay on that for just a second, because you give a lot of commencement addresses. Some of them are included in the book. What do you say to young people now who enter life in a different set of circumstances? What do you say to those young people when you give commencement addresses?
So I think for young people today, putting into historical context this moment we're in, but also reminding them that each generation has a call to action. Mm-hmm. And I think our generation, that call to action of realizing our full humanity, right? So we were also the first generation where our full humanity could be acknowledged. So as a gay man, that was something my heroes, Bayard Rustin, James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, I mean, the ability for them to sit in an audience and say, I'm gay, like that was just not possible. So we lived in the first generation where our full humanity could be embraced. So now, this generation, their full humanity is to be embraced. But the challenge of identity and the challenge for our country, as we have fully embraced, is to ensure that we maintain a common sense of identity. Right? And I think we have lost that in many ways. And I'm not blaming the fact that I say I'm gay, I'm black. I mean, those identities define who I am. But the most important identity is that I'm an American, because that is the identity that we all share, and around which we build a set of common values by which we live with each other. And I think we have to do a better job with the next generation of that. And we also have to ensure that they demand of us that we deliver on the promise of our generation, right? Because we haven't delivered on the promise of our generation. And I think they need to demand that of us.
I think that's a really important point about how people are able to be themselves. But do you believe that the opportunity escalator, elevator that you were describing exists for young people today the same way that you think it existed for you then?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. I mean, any economist who studies social mobility will tell you that depending on who you are and where you are in the country, the mobility escalator may be going, but for the most part in this country, the mobility escalator has either slowed down or has reversed. Right? So one of the things that I write about, and one of the startling trends 12 years ago that I wrote about, was what was happening with inequality in the country and connecting growing inequality with threat to democracy. And part of the reason I felt compelled to write about that was because of the impact of growing inequality on working class white Americans. Because when we consider the threat to democracy, and as we moved from really a poverty analysis at Ford to an inequality analysis, there were some who questioned whether that was prudent. And it is true, poverty remains a major issue in our society. But poverty is not a threat to democracy. It's a moral challenge and a reason for moral revulsion in the richest nation in the world. But it's not going to destroy our democracy. Inequality will destroy our democracy, because if there are enough people who feel angry, aggrieved, because they feel they are being left behind, they're being left out of an economic system that has marginalized them, that their children don't have a future, they will do things that don't seem rational to those of us who live with privilege. They lose hope, and hope is the oxygen of democracy. And if they lose hope, they lose a belief in institutions, in government, in community, how they even think about community, particularly in a democracy that aspires to be a successful, multiracial, pluralist democracy. What we see with inequality and some of the work that we supported at Princeton a decade ago was for the first time seeing indicators that we've never seen before. So indicators of well-being among working class white households. Average life expectancy going down. Indicators of health, and obviously the opioid epidemic had a big macro impact on that. Joblessness, educational achievement actually in those communities going down. And so for the first time, what became clear is that we have a population of white Americans who are downwardly mobile. And the implications for that and our democracy, there is a correlation. And so the divergence in our experiences and expectations and sense of both connectedness to community and each other becomes frayed. That's what inequality does.
To write this book, you had to look back over 12 years of speeches, writings. What did you see in the evolution of Darren Walker's thinking emerging in those 12 years?
I became more concerned about and wrote about the need to be better listeners. You also see a growing unease with some of the work around ideology having a negative effect on, and my concern about extremism being a challenge. There are a few essays in which I write about capitalism, in which I say, I'm a capitalist, but this system is not working. It is not.
You say you're a committed capitalist.
I am.
What does that mean?
What it means is I have not seen a better way to organize an economic system. And so I believe it is, but I don't believe the way it is currently organized is producing the kind of shared prosperity that our democracy needs. And we call it democratic capitalism for a reason. And my view on that is democracy can't lose to capitalism. I mean, we cannot have a system where inequality and where opportunity is so out of reach for people.
But you see no contradiction there between fighting for less income inequality and equality for human beings and capitalism.
No, I think, yes, but just to be clear, we're not going to get better capitalism without better policy, right? So we're not going to get capitalism if we have a tax policy that is skewed to benefit people like me. I mean, that's not going to produce the kind of equalizing effect, or at least a system of fairness, because this system is not fair. It's simply not. And so I am a committed capitalist, but it will only work if we have policy that produces the kind of shared prosperity that we need. And I write about that. My grandfather was semi-literate. He had a third grade education because when he was growing up, and the colored school stopped in primary, and they went to pick cotton and work in the fields as boys. But he worked as a porter and a shoe shineman for an oil company in Texas, and every employee, including the porter, was part of a profit-sharing plan. Those were typical in American corporations in the 1950s and 60s. What happened to those? Policy changed. And the tax treatment of those programs for employers changed. It became less beneficial for corporations to have those kinds of programs. There was a tax. There was a policy change. And we can look across the whole system and see the way policies changed that have contributed to the level of inequality. So there are solutions to this.
Right. One of the things, in addition to democracy and freedom and inequality that you write about, is the very real, enormous task of coming into this enormous space in this job and with a vision, which you have to have as a leader, what advice would you give the Darren Walker 12 years ago, having lived out this life?
Understand that leading Ford or leading any large, complicated organization is not a popularity contest. You hope to be respected, possibly admired. Don't expect to be liked or be popular. That leadership requires making decisions that will make some people unhappy. I also would say be comfortable following your instinct and wisdom. You need to listen more. You need to have a more participatory, consultative approach. And that is true, but you have to also be clear that you are the only person in this building responsible for the entire enterprise. But I just wish that I had listened more to myself on some of these decisions and and understood that actually you can consult and you have people participate, but you're the only person with decision rights.
Is that what you mean when you write about the tyranny of strategy, or is tyranny of strategy something else?
No, what I meant in that Stanford Social Innovation Review was more how foundation and foundation strategy tyrannizes our nonprofit partners, right? That they are terrorized by our strategies. And I said, when I was running a nonprofit in Harlem in the 90s, I never had anyone from a foundation actually say that to me. Like, how can I help you? How can we help you at our foundation? What people most often said is, we have a community revitalization strategy for low-income, disinvested Black and brown communities in America, and we've chosen Harlem as one of the communities. And our strategy is to, and so rather than coming and saying to us, what do you think our strategy should be if we want to revitalize Harlem? And so that's the tyranny, right? That's the way in which foundations and our arrogance and our hubris have sought to control. I also write about how the kind of funding that we do, which has been primarily project-based, is a way of controlling our grantees and in many ways constraining them. And why the imperative and the call to action needed to be to go from being big project funders to being unrestricted multi-year general operating support funders, right? That we would fund nonprofits if you actually believe in them, that you would give them unrestricted support to allow them to best deploy that capital. And so part of this essay was my saying, at the Ford Foundation, we have committed, and I'm happy that we went from less than 20% general operating support and 80% project support to now, the last data I saw, we were 82% general operating support and multi-year support. And that happened because when I suggested that we look at making more multi-year grants, the CFO and the general counsel, not because they were being defensive, but they said, because the board doesn't approve multi-year budgets. You're not authorized to make those grants unless you can do it out of the annual budget, which you can't really. And I thought, well, the board can approve multi-year budgets. They've never been asked to do that, but let's have a conversation about that. And come to find, actually, the board was the finance committee, the investment committee. Once you ran the analysis and you demonstrated that we were mitigating the risk and making sure that even in the worst case scenarios, the whole stress test, we were able to make payout and pay our grants. And so our board does 3-year grant. I mean, we did a 5-year build initiative. And so we had to demonstrate, pretty rigorously over 5 years, we're committing $1 billion now, but the market goes down 50%. Will we be able to pay those 5 years of grants? And the answer was yes. We can create a culture of yes. We can create a culture where we're open to and curious enough to say, well, yeah, and this was a great thing. Our investment, when I sort of raised the idea of a $1 billion bond, the first person who said yes was the CIO. He was like, yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Let's look, but like, I know some other CIOs, it would have been like, the answer is no. Or general counsels, the answer is no. And so to me, that's the whole point about being cultures of yes. And too many of us are cultures of no.
It's striking to me for me to read in the book about all the times when you were able to acknowledge that you were getting something wrong. Or for instance, like the disability conversation.
That was a disaster. That wasn't just wrong.
Well, explain it to us. What was the disaster in that?
Well, the disaster was, I wrote an essay in the New York Times in which I said inequality in our country, and it was a whole thing about inequality in our country. And I mentioned all the ways in which inequality manifests, and I never mentioned disability. And there was a lot of blowback. And I totally missed the boat. Naran Khan, who is the great director of my office, and introduced me to Judy Heumann, who changed my life. Because Judy taught me about disability and how insidious the attitudes and the policies. And it just was such an eye-opening experience for me, and it was embarrassing that it had to all be eye-opening before the public, before the staff and everyone the way it was. But yeah, I think it's really important.
I want to go back to one thing you said in the last answer. Why is it so important for you to steer forward towards supporting more resilient institutions rather than just dealing with the projects?
Well, I think philanthropy is easily dazzled, and we are looking for silver bullets, and we like shiny new objects, and so something like a program to focus on strengthening institutions. It's just not sexy. It's not. Helping the LDF get a new technology infrastructure is not sexy. There's no naming opportunity. But these things are the essential elements of success for these organizations. And yet it's so hard for donors because there's some wonderful new cool app, or there's some wonderful new developer who has designed something that is dazzling. And so at the end of the day, institutions matter. We need these institutions that will be there on the front lines to remind people of what democracy looks like.
Is it possible for you to name a favorite essay from the book?
I struggled with how much of this book to be personal, policy, solutions. And the policy and the solution part were straightforward. Actually, the hardest thing I puzzled over was including my eulogy to my David.
Wow.
And the reason I included my eulogy to my David was because he was so essential in my becoming president of Ford. And he was so incredibly proud of me. And he took such pride in the joy that I got, and he loved being at Ford and loved being the partner of the president of the Ford Foundation. And he loved traveling with me to our foreign offices. And because he really, his sensibility around the visual arts so informed my understanding of contemporary art. And so I decided to include it. And I'm actually happy I did. It may feel a little disjointed, but he was an essential part of these last 12 years and before.
Now, the last time I interviewed you was in Atlanta. You were receiving an award from a Black philanthropist organization. And the person who introduced us said that you were one of her mentors. And she says that when you got this job, she said, "Oh my God, Jerry, you got the job." And she said, you leaned out and whispered to her, "Girl, can you believe they gave me the keys to this building?" What has been your kind of fondest memory of being the president of Ford?
I think that among the things that I am most proud of and that has given me the most joy, and it may surprise some people, but has actually been our reconciliation with the Ford family. Because Henry Ford II's departure from the Ford Foundation in 1976 was a blow to this institution, to our reputation, to our standing. The Ford Foundation is the Ford Foundation. But it did not sit right with me that there was no visual representation of Henry Ford or any Ford in this building. When I came to Ford, we did not talk about Henry Ford. And understandably, Henry Ford has, to put it generously, a challenging narrative associated with him.
Diplomatic language.
However, I have embraced Henry and all his complexity because he's a metaphor for America. On the one hand, Henry Ford was the first of the capitalists to talk about the threat of inequality, that we cannot pay our workers a wage that does not allow them to buy the products that they're manufacturing. And so he actually was the first to say, I'm going to double the wages of my workers. Now, he has some labor issues later on, but let's just be on that issue. He was way ahead, right? And so it's like this country. I am willing to embrace the noble things that have come, and I'm willing to embrace the things that I regret and that are a stain on our history. And I've had many conversations with various members of the Ford family that they live with that stain, right? And so when we had the opportunity to really reconcile, and it was really really happened because during the bankruptcy, when I chaired the philanthropy committee, as we were working towards a resolution, Bill Ford, the executive chairman, and Henry's nephew, was interviewed, and they said, "Well, congratulations, the Ford Foundation has done some important work in helping Detroit with the bankruptcy." And his response was, what happened with the Ford Foundation broke my family's heart. But it ended with a real, big gathering of, several generations of Fords, of the Ford Foundation, and having our first board meeting in Detroit since the 50s. And then ultimately electing Henry Ford III to our board. And I think that I'm very proud of that because I think we are a better foundation because we are connected to the Fords. As I look back, the essay that I wrote with Edsel Ford on the rapprochement with the family is one that I'm particularly proud of.
Wow. Well, I want to thank you so much for giving us time today. And congratulations on the book. Thank you so much. Thank you guys.